be given in this session. If the stars align properly, I'll probably do this again next fall and start up about where we leave off, which is some pretty interesting stuff with the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages and so forth. But before I start today, I want to turn it over to Cheryl to talk about what she's going to be doing for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, two weeks. I'm gonna do one class on, what it is to be called by God, different calling, and the different types of calls the Bible describes. And then the second week, I'm gonna start with a historical look at who the disciples were, and then see how, the call to discipleship is the same or different for us.
Oh, I would try it if you can you get around here?
I can.
And you all have our evaluation form. We haven't done this in a while to find out what you're interested in other classes and things being, and this experience, and if you've had a Zoom experience, what that was like for you. So appreciate it if you fill that out today as well. Thank you.
Thank you all for your participation in this class the last few weeks. It has been a very meaningful experience for me. I thank you for that. It is a gift that you guys give to me to allow me to do this. What we're looking at today is finishing up with Rome. And then where I would start after this would be with the decline and fall, the big events, and looking at some of the artwork that occurs there. But what I want to talk about today is not so much the imagining Jesus part, but the new churches that Constantine built. And this becomes the context for the religious art, for most of it, for the next few centuries. Before Constantine, there were no public churches. We have some records of the church actually owning property. We're not really sure what that was all about. We do have one example of a house church, which we kind of started off with at the beginning. But there were no public churches here. Christianity was an illegal religion. It was not the only one. There were lots of others that were considered illegal. Anything that was a new religion or was a foreign religion was usually got categorized that way. But most of the time, the Roman Empire had more important things to do than persecute Christians. When the empire was struggling and in trouble and they were just trying to hang on, every now and then an emperor would arise that would try to restore the old Roman gods and would turn his ire at not only the Christian church, but the Druids and the Dionysians and a bunch of others as well. But during those times of trouble, the emperor didn't stay in power very long. He usually died in a year or two in battle. And the next emperor that comes along, his enemy is his friend, and so he befriends Christianity. And they couldn't really keep anything going very, very steady until the emperor before Constantine, Diocletian, and then Constantine converted. With Constantine, he shifts the treasury of the Roman Empire away from the old Roman temples over to the churches. And he begins to use the church, the bishops, as local governing leaders, and because they're having just a hard time keeping the government going together. And a part of this was a huge building project of building up Christian churches for the first time, public Christian churches. For the most part, these were all built outside of the cities because the cities were all filled up, and the pagan or the Roman temples continued. They were not outlawed, but they just lost the government funding. and the Christian churches were outside the cities. When we started off, I did some talking about images and the difficulty of looking at the visual arts. And I made a kind of confession that I'm becoming increasingly sensitive that I do not have an antenna out for the issue of making the art. Okay. For what, and when the artist talks about their work, that's usually what they talk about. They don't talk about what it means. They talk about how they made it. And the issue of art is the making. We usually separate that technical from artistic creativity until we come to architecture. And when we come to architecture, all of a sudden the structure of the building, how it's made, why that structure's there, is right integrated into what it means and how it functions. And that is true of these churches. It'll be true of the Romanesque. It'll definitely be true of the Gothic churches. Now, I would love to know what the conversation was when they decided what a Christian church would look like. Because they made a radical departure from what all religious architecture looked like for the Romans and the Greeks. Okay. This, of course, is a classic Greek and Roman temple. And you have these gorgeous columns on the outside, and the outside of the temple is just spectacular. The Christian churches on the outside are pretty ugly. The early ones. But on the inside, they could be spectacular. Okay. The Christian churches sometimes get described as a Greek temple turned outside in. Okay. And you'll see what I mean by that as we get going. The Greek temple is not the way that we usually picture the inside of the Greek temple. Now, not all of them, there are some exceptions, some reasons for that. But the inside of the Greek temple was basically a big dark closet that they kept the statue of the god in. There are two rooms. One you enter from the back, and it's smaller, and it is the treasury. And we don't often talk about that, but the temple was a bank, and the god or goddess protected the town's treasury. Okay, and that back part of it was the town's treasury. The front part was a kind of closet that you kept the statue in. Now, what would happen is down in the town, and the temple would often be up real high. Down in the town, they would start with dancing and singing and drinking and music, and they would process through the streets of the town up to the temple. The goddess would be brought outside, and the sacrifices would occur outside, and the worship occurs outside. What the Christians were doing was adopting the practice of the Jewish synagogue, which is a worship that occurs inside. It's readings and it's prayers and maybe some sermons. The Christians, of course, add the Lord's Supper to that. And the Christians are looking for a structure with an interior. And what they did was pick up the structure that Rome used for its government buildings, rather than the religious buildings. But we have seen this one, which is a good example, but it's not quite what they're doing for the church. What the basilica does is give a large interior space, and it has a way for providing light inside that interior space and air. Okay. And now when we say windows, we're not talking glass-filled windows. We're talking open portals. Light and air can come. And that's what they were after for a worship that occurs inside the building rather than one that occurs outside of the front. So the interior becomes everything, and the exterior less so. Now, you get the Gothic cathedrals and the Romanesque, more and more becomes important on the outside, but it's these early ones, this really didn't look like much on the outside. This is kind of the design, and it's similar, but you'll notice it's not exactly the same as Constantine's basilica. There are two different styles. One is a central plan with a dome, and the other is the regular basilica plan. The one with the dome tends to be used for baptistries and mausoleums, but it becomes a broader use eventually. This right here is basically St. Peter's Basilica. St. Peter's Basilica, constructed by Constantine, lasts all the way to the Renaissance. It's built out of wood. It went through centuries of lawlessness and wars. I don't know how the thing didn't burn to the ground. There's got to be a story there. I mean, they started building out of stone because the churches were burning. And how this thing survived. And we have stories of it in the Dark Ages where the roof leaked, it wasn't taken care of, and walls needed to be reinforced. And I mean, you're talking from about 300 all the way to Michelangelo in the 1500s. This building had a lot of use. All right. They needed a building committee here or something. There is on this one an outdoor courtyard that'll disappear. And the main church is this part right here. St. Peter's, there's a fountain in the courtyard, at least at the beginning. And you notice these little dots here, those are columns. Now with St. Peter's, the columns aren't the gorgeous columns that you see on the Greek temples. Later, with other churches, they will be, and that really makes a striking difference for the interior. You walk in here, I don't know if they actually used the same words we use, narthex and nave, but these are the words that get used for it. You walk in through the narthex, you come into here, you've got these columns, and it really, looking at it from here, it really doesn't describe what's going on. This nave here is a big open space, and that's where the sanctuary is. Okay, that's where the worship occurred. Then you have two columns, or two rows of columns here, and what they make is aisles over here that people can move around. This is pretty much very close to the floor plan of our sanctuary. Okay, and I'm sure that was deliberate. I'm sure that wasn't done without being aware of this history. Now, you have a transept up here and an apse. The transept, when you walk in here, you're walking in and you've got all of these columns, and everything focuses the attention on the altar, which is up here. Okay, so everything focuses the attention on the altar. My dad, when I was in Chicago, I took my mom and dad to Fourth Presbyterian Church to worship, and it was a different kind of experience for them. And my dad was really puzzled that the pulpit wasn't in the center, but he called it a communion table was in the center. Okay. Preaching becomes central for Protestantism and with Luther, but still the altar, not the communion table, that is the center here, and everything is focused on that.
Steve,
Now, yes.
so we talk about where the preaching was. Even if you look at that here in Geneva, the pulpit is off to the side and up high.
Yeah.
And so even in the Protestant Church of the Reformation, it's still the altar is still more central than the pulpit.
Yeah.
And also in the Reformed tradition, we do not have an altar.
It is.
Never called an altar.
It is a.
It is a communion table. Now, with the transept and the apse, what happens in time is those will be extended so that the shape of the church will take on that of the cross. Okay, you don't quite have that here, but that's how it will be adapted over time. The apse is an odd feature, and the best I can do to explain it is some speculation of my own, which makes sense to me. In some of the interior Roman temples, they did have an interior. One of the most prominent was the Pantheon. It's a big dome that's still there in Rome. And it has a huge ocular at the top of the dome, which is open to the sky, so that you can get air and you can get light inside here. The Pantheon then has these niches all the way around for the Pantheon of gods, and they would have the different statues of the gods in. Those niches with gods in, okay? It's like more sacred space, and in the synagogue that we looked at Dura Europos, you have that niche where the Torah scrolls went to. Okay, didn't have a god in there, but you had a Torah scroll. When Christianity decides to build this, the Basilica of Constantine already had a niche which contained Constantine's 40-foot tall statue, which we saw. The head of Constantine was 6 feet tall. There are questions whether that actually could have happened, because they can't imagine that the marble or the stone would carry the weight. But that was the intention of it anyway. Christianity continues with that apse. Sometimes there'll be a smaller altar in there, and it'll be kind of a little chapel. And sometimes there'll be these niches all around the church like that. That niche, that apse, points to Jerusalem. It points east. Okay. The way that Islamic mosques point to Mecca, all Christian churches in the West pointed to the east. So when you're reading about the Gothic Cathedral and they tell you the east portal and the west portal, and you're like, how do I know which one is east and west? Well, you're supposed to know that the church is pointing east. Okay. Now, all right. Now, this column right here supports this wall right here above the roof. That wall above the roof, called the clerestory, has the windows. And those windows go all the way around, providing light and air. They have no electric light bulbs. Okay, this is the story. And the church isn't used during the nighttime. Yes, they had candles, yes, but
They had oil lamps. They did not have candles.
oh, okay, oil lamps, okay. Yes, you're right.
No candles.
You're right. There is another aisle, another row of columns here supporting this. And I really don't understand this part. There's actually a row of windows underneath that roof, which I don't quite get. And then another row of windows here. Another row of windows here. This is Old St. Peter's Basilica. Nobody ever comments about this. It must be a little chapel. An interesting little aside on this. When Islam begins constructing their first mosques, they follow the design of the Christian church with a big difference, huge difference. For one thing, they keep the court, and the open courtyard is a big part with a fountain, and they move it around to the side. The open courtyard with the fountain, you walk in, and that's where you do your washings. Before you go in to pray, you wash your hands, head, feet, and take your shoes off. You enter, it is the basilica turned on its side. In the Christian church, you walk in here, and the columns focus space on the altar. Here, with the Islamic, you walk in here, and the columns break up and diffuse space. And it's not focused. And it'll sometimes be a forest of columns breaking up that space, and then they continue adding to it. So this forest of columns becomes even more complex. The apse is put over here. And the apse, it's called a mihrab, and it points to Mecca. There was a Islamic mosque outside Cincinnati that I used to take some of my students to. And when they built that thing, they actually had people not just point the thing east, they aligned it with the globe so that it pointed the shortest distance toward Mecca, which was not east. So they aligned the building on the planet in a way that was very deliberate, pointing toward Mecca, rather than just toward the east, which wasn't from Cincinnati, wasn't shortest distance, wasn't east. I don't know, some of you might, I don't know if there are any churches these days that are constructed pointing to Jerusalem. I think not. I think not, but it would be an interesting thing. Now here's St. Peter's, and the columns are really posts. They're not that impressive, but you'll get to see what I mean by a Greek temple turned outside in with some of the others that we looked at. You can see the clerestory up here. These are the aisles. Important point, there are no pews. Pews don't come into the church until the 1500s. Both Catholics and Protestants begin to introduce pews. This is all open space. Everybody stands. You see pictures of them in the 1500s, and the aristocracy are coming in with their dogs. I don't know if they cleaned up after them or not, but they come in with their dogs. You got birds flying around in a lot of these churches because the windows are open to the air. And everybody just kind of, at least in the 1500s, everybody just kind of stands around, mills around, talks, and carries on while the priest is up there doing his thing. And when the priest lifts the elements, everything stops and the attention is focused on the altar. And then it goes back to conversation again. For at least during the time of Luther, and the history of the church, of course, the Mass and the Eucharist all changed the way that they're done. But in the time of Luther, before the Protestants, you only took communion one time a year. You were obligated to take it that one time a year. That was Easter. And that's what Lent was for. You had to prepare for that one time a year that you took it. The rest of the time, it was seeing. It was seeing the elements. It was seeing Christ. That was the important center of it. Okay. Now, St. Peter's Basilica. This one shows it with the fountain. Pretty similar. 320 to 27.
Steve,
Yeah.
I'm wondering in the like the atrium area there,
Yes.
did that eventually turn into like a graveyard, or that's something totally different?
Well, the real answer is I don't know. But I think no.
Okay,
I think I'm pretty sure not.
because I look at the old churches in like the East Coast, and a lot of them have like a graveyard surrounding
Oh, yeah, and
really old.
you really see that in England.
So directly underneath the altar, you go down in St. Peter's to where the grave areas are.
Mm.
So it's actually directly underneath, at least where the current St. Peter's is.
Yeah, many of these churches were constructed on sacred sites where martyrs had occurred. St. Peter's claimed to be situated with the altar directly above the burial of Peter and Paul. Protestants scoffed at that for centuries, and then the Pope took a chance and allowed an archaeological dig to occur under the altar at St. Peter's. And they did not find the burial of Peter and Paul, but they did find a memorial there, which seemed to indicate maybe it was constructed at that place. One of the popes came out to chase off the Hun. Some of you might remember this. I'm just pulling it out of my memory now. Carrying the skull of St. Peter, or maybe it was Peter and Paul, to frighten off the Hun from attacking Rome. He may have misplaced it and not put it back. I don't know. But there were stories of things like that went along. Again, you can kind of see, even from the sketch, the place of the columns inside, why it could be called a Greek temple turned outside in. And some of them, that'll become even more apparent. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay. Constantine's mother, Helena, who was a great figure in the church at the time, went to Jerusalem and located what she believed were the sacred sites in the life of Jesus, and established churches at those sites. That's what this is. The domed circular pattern here is the empty grave, or the empty grave of Christ. This part here you'll recognize as the basilica, and you got a picture of the apse on there to see what that's like. The court is much diminished, and notice this wall around it here. When we talked about the different style of the Roman house at Dura Europos, the house church, I talked about how the Roman house wasn't like our houses. It was a fortress to defend the family against the lawlessness in the street, the mobs and the riots that occur occasionally. And the house church, with its open courtyard inside the church or the house, was pretty typical. This looks like almost fortifications there. And I wonder that that's not part of the purpose of it. Okay, late Empire, after Constantine, where it's all going, heading toward the sack of Rome in the year 410, give more storyline on that. After Constantine, the civil wars and the instability start up again. You have, and if I hadn't all my lecture notes here that I'd have gone over beforehand, I'd remember some of the details a little better. Julian the Apostate, I think, was a son, maybe a grandson. And he kept secret that he wasn't a Christian. And he was made emperor, and for about 2 or 3 years, he tried to restore the old Roman religions. There are stories where he would visit one of the old temples, and they couldn't find a priest who knew how to do the ceremonies anymore in just a short time. Julian, one of the problems with the old religions was that it was hard to compete with Christianity with its theology and its teaching. Julian labored hard to turn Neoplatonism into a kind of theology, but he never really succeeded. Theodosius is probably the most significant and important emperor during this period, 379 to 395. He rules for quite a while. And Theodosius, of course, is Christian, and it's him that outlaws the old religion, makes them illegal. A lot of the Roman senators put up a fight, and there were arguments back and forth that still get studied today between the senators and Ambrose, the bishop. He closed the old Athenian schools, philosophic schools. He made the church courts independent of the state. The church requires some independence. And Theodosius gets in the fight with Bishop Ambrose. Ambrose was probably the main leader of the church, bishop of Milan. Yeah, thank you. And there are good stories about Ambrose. And Theodosius wanted to turn one of the churches in Milan over to the Arians, who were still a force. And Ambrose said no, and he conducts the sit-in. And Augustine's mother, Monica, was in there with him. And so it's a fight between church and state already. And then the sack of Rome in the year 410, which we'll eventually get to. I do not understand how this church could have been built. There's got to be a story here. I visited it. I've done some reading on it, never heard any explanation. The sack of Rome occurs in 410. Now, the city of Rome is not destroyed. The sack of Rome sounds like the city's destroyed. The Germans sweep in, they loot, they pillage, and then they move on. But it is just a symbolic act of Rome being violated, and it's just a huge event psychologically for the empire. This church was built in the 430s. During the collapse of the empire and the lawlessness of all of that, I do not understand how that could be. It is one of the most amazing churches here. This is Santa Maria Maggiore, and this is an old sketch. What I'll show you, the columns look much more impressive, but it's very similar to the basilica that we've spoken of. You walk in here, everything is focused on the altar. The columns march down in the straight line, focusing that attention. You've got the clerestory up here, much larger windows. And this is what it looks like today in black and white. A Greek temple turned outside in. Yeah, what were you gonna say something?
This is just rolling around in my head. I believe the women were not allowed in the temple, with their husbands had to stay in the courtyard. And what?
In the temple or in the church?
Sure. I don't know. And I was just wondering what year they were allowed to.
I don't know that. I don't know that. The customs of gender are really complicated, particularly during this time. There is a lot of very bitter misogyny among the church fathers. And there are women saints. There are women heroes of the faith. Some of them, if you do the studies, are actually challenging the male leaders, and their stories get rewritten. So they're not challenging the male leaders. The misogyny in the early church, and that's not in the time of Paul. That's not the case in the time of Paul. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were restrictions like that, but I can't speak to them.
Stephen, we talked about the inside columns. There's a lot of theology of light in churches, and you want to have as much light as possible. And so you have all these technical problems trying to solve is try to make as much windows as you can, and you bear the weight for that. And
You're right on that, Rich, but that occurs much later than this. And that's rooted in what today we call pseudo-Dionysus or Dionysus. And that really plays a role with the Gothic cathedral. The Romanesque churches beforehand build in stone. Because they build in stone, they can't have these windows. And those churches are extremely dark. But the breakthrough was with the Gothic cathedral, which allowed them to have these stone churches with great walls of glass holding up the stone roof. And it's, you know, really an astonishing accomplishment.
Like flying buttresses.
That's right. And the pointed arches and so forth, and the ribs. This is made out of wood, so it's much lighter material, and it allows them to have windows. But still, even then, they're rather limited in what they can do with the windows. And of course, light is an emblem, a symbol that's throughout Scripture, throughout the culture of Greeks and Romans and Mesopotamians, and all of that is there, but it really becomes a feature with the Gothic cathedral and Dionysus. This is what it looks like in color.
Oh, nice.
Now, you have to, again, this church don't look like mine from the outside,
Mhm.
but the interior is just spectacular. Yeah.
And I was gonna say, the cathedrals Richard I visited in Europe anyway. I asked someone one time, I said, why is there always scaffolding on the outside? And they said, because they're so big, there's always something to repair. I mean, it really detracts from the appearance, but it's always there anyway.
I went to a very unusual Romanesque. I don't think it was a church. It's hard for me. I think it was one of the industrial magnates, you know, like with the railroads and all that at the turn of the century. In Philadelphia, brought artisans from Europe to build this. He had more money than sense. A lot of these people, I mean, huh?
Huntington. I think so.
I don't know. It was a Swedenborgian. So, yeah, so I'm thinking not, but he built this this thing, and I was astonished. They actually brought the windows from Chartres and from other great, and I guess they're continually replacing those. They're continually replacing sculptures and windows from the Gothic cathedrals of Europe were actually incorporated, but they were the cast-offs. Yeah, so there could, now that point, okay, this is not a museum that tries to preserve exactly how it looked at the beginning. It is a living church with a parish continually adjusting and changing. The gold that you see up here is the first shipment that Spain brought back from the Americas.
Wow.
Spain did not view that gold as money, but as treasure. And they put all the gold in the church. And of course, Spain went through one bankruptcy after another. They couldn't seem to get this capitalist system right. And Spain, the most powerful, richest empire in European history, just went bankrupt one time after another. They were the bankers up in the Netherlands taking advantage of it. But so they put their gold on the church instead of using it as money. I did get to visit this place, and I've only made one trip to Europe. I'm not that well traveled, and I said, I teach this stuff. I know this stuff. I read it. I really don't have any need to go there. I couldn't have been more wrong. I couldn't have been more wrong at all. When I walked in here, I had no idea of the scale, for one thing, and things that I thought would be prominent were actually tiny little things. I mean, you really got no, But look, here's, you can see the people. Look at the scale of that.
Wow.
There's a huge space. This was built in the midst of the catastrophe of the Germans, tribes racing through Rome. How did they build this thing? 430. I don't understand this. You can see the clerestory, the columns down here, and it is a very impressive place. Today, there's a chapel off here, which is probably twice the size of our church. And you have, notice, this is the altar, the high altar. There's something, it's an odd thing, they have it at St. Peter's today. There's a baldacchino that kind of makes a canopy over the altar. You'll see that getting in the way of us looking at some pictures. Here. Okay, this is the baldacchino. And
5 minutes.
what's that?
About 5
Okay,
minutes.
okay. This is one of the remarkable things about Santa Maria Maggiore. It's just full of mosaics from back in the 430s.
Wow.
And here, now the Romans did mosaics, but they did mosaics on the floors when you walked on. And some of them were very artistic. Most of them were not so much. Christianity started doing mosaics up on the walls. And you didn't walk on them, and they started using precious materials, gold, other things. The Byzantines are what's really known for this. I can comment a little bit about this, but I haven't done all the homework to be able to give a good, thorough explanation for what's going on here, but I just want you to see it. Okay, this one commonly ends up in the history of art books. It's a tiny little thing under one of the windows in the clerestory, and you can't hardly see it because of the light that's coming. It's very different than I would have expected, but it is interesting. You have two figures here, Abraham and Lot, both done to classical proportions. They're not these little short midget dwarfish characters, both done to classical proportions. They're both moving, but then you've got the other characters that are not in correct proportion. And then you've got this, we did All Saints today. This is kind of what that is. Lot is making a decision to move to the cities. That leaves Abraham to move to the countryside. Decision that they make affects generations. That's the message here. These are some of the pictures behind the altar. The Christ child in the temple. You have the Holy Family in Egypt, the New Jerusalem, the sheep, and the Magi before Herod. You still don't have the crucifixion of Christ, and you still don't have the nativity scene. The two things that we, and you still don't have those two. But you do have Christ as a baby. And this, I wish I knew more about. I can just tell you what I see. You have Christ and Mary both seated on a throne. Christ is handing a crown to Mary. Christ has a book in his hand, which is becoming more and more common. I don't know what that book is. You have angels around. You have maybe the heavens. Here's another, San Apollinaire in Ravenna, another church with the columns inside. These buildings that are almost ugly on the outside, very different than the Greek temples.
Yeah, right, that's why the Germans did.
Gorgeous inside. What's that?
I think that's why the Germans did.
Well, yeah, it's like these places where people have the outside all trashy so they don't get taxed. I saw that up in Michigan. Grandpa lived. And the inside would be all furnished and nice. Notice how out of place the pews are. And notice the proportions, the size of the space there. All right. If we can get it to come back, if we can get this to come back next fall, the stars all align, we'll start off with what happens after the fall of Rome. And we'll look at the mausoleum of Galla Placidia and some of the Byzantine works and some other things. And the illuminated manuscripts, the Bibles with all the paintings in them. Okay. Lynn, you don't have anything else. Okay,
Nope.
I think
Next
you
week
want
is
to
Cheryl.
collect.
Yes,
These
we'll
things-
collect these on the way out.
Okay. Cheryl, could you dismiss it to prayer again?
Lord Jesus, thank you so much for this time together and for Steve partaking, giving to us, his expertise and knowledge. And we just thank you for that. And just be with us now as we go out from here, that we can do your will in your name.
Thank you.
You know, in that